Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being with us as we join this critical and timely program. My name is Karen Levin. I am the Executive Director of the Baltimore Zionist District. But hold on, an echo on my YouTube. Okay, there we go. It's my pleasure and honor to have with us this evening, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. I had a pleasure of meeting him back in October when he was here with us live in person at our Israel Symposium. If you did not get a chance to see that Israel Symposium, I highly recommend that you go back to our YouTube page. Dee is going to drop the link for you in the chat. Go back, please, and check that out at some point when you have some time at your convenience. It was a wonderful program that we did. We were honored to have Jonathan with us back then, and we're honored to have him back here with us tonight. Jonathan, I'm so appreciative to have you here tonight. I admire your writing. I genuinely admire your work, your article, and everything that you do for the state of Israel and beyond every single day. Jonathan is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation of Defense for Democracies. Thank you again for being with us. You have your newly launched book, The Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and the 11 Days of War. Thank you for sending me a copy. I read a lot of it over Thanksgiving break when we were away with 15 people in one house. So it was a lot to take in with so many people, but I tried my best. I didn't get through all of it, but what I read was incredible. I wanted to, here's the book. It looks, oh, I'm blurred, but can you see the book? Well, you have a lot behind you. So you have a lot of copies behind you. But I wanted to talk about really Jonathan's holding it up and he has a lot of copies behind it. But I wanted Jonathan to, when we start, to talk about the timing of your book. And of course, we're talking about the horrific events, which for me on a personal note is always, personally is hard to talk about. I have Israeli born and have lived here for a long time. I came here at the age of 10. But of course, when events like this take place in Israel, it's always hits me. And I'm sure many people on this call as well in a personal way. I have a lot of family that lives there still, a lot of friends that live there still. And so when you're sleeping here and then you wake up and you hear news like that and your phone is constantly beeping and you hear news and your friends are writing you and you're hearing news and you're hearing something like this. So we're talking about the events that took place in May of 2021. And then we're talking about your book that dropped in November 3rd of 2021. So can you take us through why you wrote this book and the significance of the turnaround time that the book came through so quickly?
Sure. Well, first of all, Karen, thank you so much for having me here today. And Adi, thank you. I really did enjoy the symposium back in October, and I was thrilled to hear from you about doing a book event. Yeah, I mean, the story of why I wrote it, I think will probably resonate with a lot of you. I mean, I watched the war closer than I had ever watched any of the others. This was the fourth Gaza war since 2009. There was one in 2009, one in 2012, one in 2014, and then this one. Each time it's gotten more intense in terms of the rockets that are fired, the accuracy of the rockets, the payload of the rockets, but also what has gotten more intense is the coverage here in the United States and around the world because of social media. Because of the polarization of just even our cable television networks, everything that is political is more angry. And I can't think of a topic that is more saturated in media coverage than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so I watched that war on my TV screen. Now, I was able to do that from the comfort of my home here in Maryland. because of smart TV and smartphone technology. Of course, it was around in 2014, but it wasn't as advanced as it is today. And I got to say, and I'll just, I'll tell you, I'm not an investor in Apple. I don't represent Apple, but Apple TV was amazing for me because they have two different apps that you can watch, Channel 11, Con TV, and Channel 13, and you can watch them on Apple, and it would pop up on my big screen. So I was able to sit and watch on my laptop. I was able to watch some of the cable channels, or I was able to watch Twitter, scrolling through it all day while also keeping an eye on Israeli television. And I'll just say that bias is a word that we hear a lot in this space. Bias doesn't begin to cover the mistakes and the erroneous coverage that we saw during the May 2021 war. I don't even think fake news is a good term to use, because that means that people are making things up. For me, I watched the decisions that were being made by the journalists that were deployed in Israel and to Gaza, even those in the Gaza Strip, the decisions that they made about the stories that they would cover. And in many cases, the way they got it absolutely wrong, often because they weren't watching what was being broadcast on Israeli TV. They made very, very simple and stupid mistakes. But really what drove me crazy more than anything was the way in which Israel was vilified. Israel was being blamed for war crimes. You may remember that the New York Times at the end of the conflict put like all the pictures of the people who are under, I don't know, the age of 21 or something on the front page above the fold. And I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy. I mean, Hamas started this war. Hamas was the one that was actually engaging in war crimes during all of this. And anyway, it didn't sit right with me. And so when I was done watching the war and covering it for my think tank for FDD, I was tired, and I spent a kind of a weekend just sleeping. And thankfully, my kids left me alone. I was able to catch up on my sleep. But what was amazing to me is that I woke up when it was time to go back to work on that next Monday. And I realized I was still furious at the coverage. I was still outraged at how poorly covered it was. And so I decided to write a book. And so here's what I did. Over 8 days, I wrote probably 15 to 20 hours a day. When I was done with those 8 days, I had 120 pages of a rough draft. And then I flew to Israel. Now, getting into Israel, as Adi could probably tell you over the summer and even today, it's not an easy thing to do. I had to take a COVID test before I went. I had to take a test when I landed in Ben Gurion Airport, and then I had to wait for a blood test to come back to make sure that I had antibodies, and then I could run around. But what was amazing was that there were no other Americans like me running around trying to talk to people in the IDF and in the intelligence and in the political apparatus. So I had unbelievable access. I met with the number 2 in the Kiryat in the Defense Department. I met with the general who was in charge of the war in Southern Command, Eliezer Toledano. I met with some of the top people, and I got terrific insight from them. And then I came back and I edited, and we finished the book. We put it out through my think tank, through Amazon services. We went from ceasefire to bookshelf in 166 days. Now, if you want to ask me why I was in such a hurry, I'll tell you. In another 6 months, in another 8 months, we're going to see a lot of other books that come out about this war. And they are all going to regurgitate the absolutely poor coverage that we saw during the war itself. And they're going to be quoting what we would all call credible sources: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. The problem is they all got it wrong. So I call them out in the book, and I explain how they got it wrong. I explain the way that they should understand the conflict itself. After all, we've now seen 4 of them, and there is sort of a cadence to them. They have a certain rhyme almost. And so I explain how they rhyme. I explain the role of state sponsors like Iran, which nobody talked about during the war. And I talk about the history of Hamas. And of course, Hamas is a terrorist group that's been around since the late 1980s. It has a lot of blood on its hands, but yet when we hear what our news was saying, what was going on cable TV, what we read in our papers, made it seem like Hamas was fighting some kind of war of liberation. So this book is an attempt to set the record straight. So far, I'm hearing that it does that, but of course, I haven't gone toe to toe with some of the authors of the new books that will come out in another half a year.
So following up on that, Jonathan, it makes me nervous when you talk about these books that are going to come out, which are eventually going to come out, and I fear that they're going to come out soon. How do we, and your book is so good and it speaks the truth to us, how do we as Jews, how do we as Israelis, how do we as organizations, this organization and other organizations which I know that you've spoken to, how do we share what is true and continue to share? And there are, and not just Jews, correct? Because there are Jews that don't share the truth. And I'm talking about Jews, I'm talking about our allies, because we do have allies that are not Jewish. But how do we continue to spread the message that you are sharing within this book? Because it's so hard with what we see nowadays on social media, on the news, but continue to share what you have shared in this book without constantly being hit in the face with the lies.
Look, it's a tough environment, and I think we all know that. I wrote the book so that everyone can share it. And I certainly recommend it. I'm not going to get rich off of this book. We put it out through my nonprofit think tank. So I'm not saying this because I want to line my pockets. I'm telling you that I wrote this exactly for this reason, so that people can be better armed. But part of the thing is that also arming yourself with this information means learning it when there isn't a crisis, being able to digest this information, not when Israel's under fire, not when you're watching rockets and mortars flying in the air, an Iron Dome, saving thousands of lives and just holding your breath that it continues to do that. The goal is to understand the history of Hamas and to be able to share it. The goal is to be able to explain how Israel actually fights wars defensively and surgically so that it cuts down on the number of casualties. The goal is to explain the role of Iran, which is the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and to explain how hundreds of millions of dollars over the years have flowed from the coffers of the central bank in Tehran to Hamas. All of these things often go missing. And so the key always is to be able to learn when you're not under fire, to learn when you're not under pressure, to have these things at your fingertips so when the time comes, you're prepared. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, know a lot about Israel. And I've always said this. This is my 4th book and the third one on the Palestinians. And I've always said this as one of the reasons why I write these books. People know a lot about Israel. They can talk about 1948, 1967, 1973. They can talk about Lebanon, the Intifada. They can talk about how terrific the IDF is and how inclusive it is. It has women. It has, LGBTQ. They've got people with special needs in the IDF. There are all these wonderful things that you can talk about with regard to Israel itself, that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. But how many of you can speak about Israel's enemies with the same fluency? How many of you can talk about the origins of Hamas or the origins of Iranian support to Hamas, or how Iran and Hamas single-handedly destroyed the peace process in the 1990s? These are the sorts of things that I try to explain in the book, but really they're so crucial for the ability to go toe-to-toe with those that want to distort. And unfortunately, we see a lot more of it. There are a lot of activists out there, and all they need is a Twitter handle. And so it obviously is very frustrating. I do this, I'm an analyst at a think tank, and my job is to look at these things. And it is truly remarkable to see the distortion and how much more it's being amplified today than even 7 years ago from the last round of the Gaza war.
What started this war?
Well, that's an interesting question. So if you read the papers and you go back and look at all the websites from the major publications, they're going to tell you that it was a real estate dispute in the eastern Jerusalem neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. Now, Sheikh Jarrah, if you've ever been to the American Colony Hotel or even the Damascus Gate, you have been in this area. Now, I will tell you that real estate disputes do not cause wars. Rockets and bombs and guns cause wars. And so when you see this sort of stuff in the news, I can tell you that it is deliberately misleading. And we've seen this before, by the way. Ariel Sharon walks on the Temple Mount, and people say that that causes the Second Intifada. Or even the 1929 riots, the first round of real violence between Israel and the Jews of the area and the Palestinians. They said that it was because Jews brought religious items down to the Western Wall compound, and that's what started the war. The media loves to point to these single points, these flashpoints, and they say, well, that's what caused it. Now, let's take a look at this real estate conflict. If you go back and look at the story, it's amazing that it's gone on. It's gone on for almost a century. It started before the creation of the state of Israel, when Jews bought homes in this particular area. And they maintained those homes until 1948, 1949, when the War of Independence broke out. Now, of course, we all know that Jordan conquered East Jerusalem during the War of Independence. So Jordan occupied this area, and the Jews that owned those homes were kicked out of that territory. And so they couldn't inhabit the homes, and other Arab residents moved in. And they stayed there until the 1967 Six-Day War, which is when Israel liberated East Jerusalem. And when that happened, this is, I think, the most interesting thing to note. When Israel retook this territory, they did not kick out the Arab inhabitants. They took them to court. And this court case has been going on, I want to say, for 5 decades. And the court case was about to come to a ruling right before the war began. And that's when people started saying that this was going to be the cause. I have a whole different idea about what actually caused the war. In my view, there was something that flew under the radar for months. It actually started, everybody remembers the Abraham Accords that were signed in September of 2020, brokered by President Donald Trump. These were peace agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, a remarkable moment, as I think all of you can attest, that all these Arab states were willing to shake hands and make peace with Israel. Well, it was at that moment that the Palestinians kind of looked at themselves. They looked at one another and said, we have a problem here. The Arab world doesn't care about the Palestinian issue any longer. We need to hold elections, and we need to refresh our political system. We need to regain our legitimacy. And so they made that announcement in the fall of 2020. And then Trump left office and Biden came in. And when Biden came in, he actually began to talk about how important, or his administration talked about how important it would be to hold those elections. And I can actually tell you that I had conversations with Biden administration officials where I said, guys, you're making a mistake. Not because we don't want to see a democracy in the Palestinian territories. It's because Hamas is going to take part. And Hamas is a terrorist organization that seeks the destruction of the state of Israel. And by the way, if Hamas wins seats in those elections, it will trigger laws that were put in place by a guy that some of you may have heard of. His name was Senator Joe Biden. He put laws in the books that said that if Hamas takes part in any aspect of the Palestinian government, then America must cut off all funds, and America must cut off political and diplomatic relations. And so there was a crisis brewing. And I think in the end, a lot of the Arab states, Israel, certainly folks like me here in the United States, we pushed the Biden administration to work with the Palestinians to cancel those elections. It was a huge mistake to support them in the first place. It would have even been a bigger mistake to hold them. But what happened is that Hamas found itself suddenly unable to take part, right? They got blocked from the political process, and they were furious. And they wanted to put themselves front and center again and to demonstrate to the Palestinians that they were the leading Palestinian faction. And so how do you do that if you are not able to take part in elections? And if you're Hamas, and the only thing that you really know how to do is to lob rockets at Israel, I will tell you, that's exactly what they decided to do. They decided to launch a war. They used the Sheikh Jarrah real estate dispute as an excuse for their war, which they launched to draw attention to themselves and to try to demonstrate to the Arab world and to the Palestinians writ large that they were the ones in charge. Today, they still look stronger than the Palestinian Authority, and I think it's exactly for that reason.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was gonna save this question, but you brought it up, so I'm just gonna go with it. I always preface this by saying that BZD is not a political organization, and we don't represent either side of the political spectrum. But I would ask this question whether Biden was in power or Trump was in power or any other person that may be in power. But I do want your perspective. And I know that your think tank is the same way, not a political organization. So that's why I feel confident in asking this question. But I do want to address and ask you how do you feel, or how did the Biden administration do during this particular 11-day situation period?
It's a great question. So I'm going to tell you that, first of all, FDD is nonpartisan. I'm not going to attack a party. And what I'm going to tell you is based on my observations that, that were mine during the war. They don't belong to my organization. So there's the good, the bad, the worse, and the ugly. And I'll go through all four of them. Okay. The good is that President Biden actually had Israel's back. It was a word, actually, that for those of you that know Hebrew, I heard the word gibui constantly during the war. And we heard it from Defense Minister Benny Gantz. We heard it from then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We heard it from IDF. We heard it from everybody that Biden was blocking UN measures against Israel. He was defending Israel's right to defend itself in the public. And the Israelis were thrilled, because it meant that for 9 out of those 11 days, Israel was fighting a war, and it knew that the president was giving it the ability to strike at Hamas terrorist targets, not to turn Gaza into a parking lot, not to commit war crimes, as some people were alleging, which did not happen. Right? I mean, during the course of that war, yes, there was death and destruction, but the Israelis actually limited casualties to around 200 people, which is remarkable given the sheer number of rockets, 4,000 rockets plus fired out of Gaza, and Israel fired something like 3 times that in response. But they were able to do that surgically. And I believe the president understood it, and he gave Israel all of the time and space that it needed to be able to defeat Hamas, which it did. Now, that's the good. Okay. Here's the bad. Okay. On the last 2 days of the war, I'm watching actually Al Arabiya, is Arabic television channel out of the UAE, and they make this announcement: Egypt has achieved a ceasefire. And I'm thinking, oh, thank God, I can start sleeping again, and Israelis can start sleeping again. My red siren is going to stop going off on my phone. Everybody can go back to normal. Okay. But what the caveat is that it was going to take 2 days for the ceasefire to take effect. So we're going to have to wait a little bit for the war to end. And that's when I saw something really strange, that for the last 48 hours of the war, and by the way, the rockets had really slowed down. Hamas was firing less. Israel was firing less. The cadence of the war had really dropped. And you could tell it was almost over. But what was amazing was when President Biden began to issue tough statements to Israel. And there were leaks coming out of the White House. And I was talking to some of the journalists who were, hearing from White House officials who were telling them, well, Biden's done kidding around with Bibi, and he's had enough with Bibi's antics in Gaza, and that's enough of this war. Now, why did he do that? In my opinion, he understood that he had done what he needed to do for Israel. And then in the last 2 days of the war, he started messaging to a very specific group of legislators. Some people call them the squad. I like to call them the Hamas caucus in Congress. These are the people that have tried to zero out Iron Dome. These are the people that are trying to deprive Israel of the funding and of the weaponry that we provide the Israelis through our aid package. Much of it, by the way, is munitions bought here in the United States, but they are trying to zero it out. And I believe that the president was really trying to message to the far left of his base, his political base. And I think it was cheap politics at the end of the day. And so I would criticize the president there, but I would actually take it a step further, because there were 2 things that I think that he did that was far worse. The third thing, I gave you the good, I gave you the bad. Now I'll give you the worse. And the worst is that he supported those Palestinian elections in the first place. Had he not done that, I don't think there would have been a war. What he did is he put the Palestinians at odds with one another. Y'all have to remember that the PLO and Hamas hate each other. They can't agree on the color of hummus. Okay, they've been in a civil war since 2007, and they are not interested in working together. In fact, they hate each other. Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip. The PLO is in control of the West Bank. We call it Hamasistan and West Bankistan, if you will, right? And these two sides have been at war since 2007. And, the idea that we would encourage them to hold an election together when Hamas still seeks the destruction of the state of Israel and still engages in terrorist activity, it was a huge mistake. And it led, I think, to the tensions that ultimately spilled over into a war. And so I blame the Biden administration for even thinking that was a good idea. George Bush thought that was a good idea in 2006. He encouraged the Palestinians to have an election. Hamas won. And when Hamas wasn't able to form a government, then it actually carried out a war in Gaza, leading to the situation that we're in today. And so let's just make it very clear. The Biden administration made a big mistake. It was a policy error. It wasn't political. It was just it was just poor judgment. Now, the last part, I gave you the good, I gave you the bad, and I gave you the worst. Now I'm going to give you the ugly. The ugly is that throughout the war, and even to this day, the Biden administration is trying to get back into that Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is the deal that was entered into in 2015, and it gave Iran $150 billion, give or take, in sanctions relief. And at the time, the Obama administration said, don't worry about it. We are going to track all of that money, and it will not go to bad uses. It will not be used for terrorism. Well, as it turns out, it was used for terrorism. And I think at this point, that's indisputable. Money trickled into the hands of Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas. Now, what's remarkable about that, what's important to note here, is that the United States, throughout this war, was still trying to get back into the deal. And if they still sign it, and they still might, they may get back into some kind of a nuclear deal with Iran. They're working on it right now. If that happens, America will be in a situation for the first time ever, to my knowledge, that it will be knowingly providing assistance to Israel on the one hand, and then knowingly providing indirect assistance to Hamas on the other. In other words, if money goes to Iran and they know, which they do, that it'll trickle into the hands of the terrorist groups that Iran supports, then America will be funding both sides of the fifth Gaza conflict. And that is something that no American administration should ever put itself in the position of. And I continue to say that the Iran deal is a huge mistake. I would probably guess that BZD feels largely the same way, but it would be a huge problem for the United States to be funding both sides of the next Israel-Hamas conflict.
I would agree that we feel the same way. Yes. So that is the role of Iran in the conflict. I mean, that is not how that's the role that Iran is taking place in this conflict. And
look, I mean, I can take it a step further in terms of what Iran does. What people, I think, don't often remember is that when Hamas was born in the late 1980s, it didn't have a lot of assistance, and Iran provided that assistance. They actually took Hamas commandos to Sudan to train them. They took them to places like Syria to train them. They provided them with the know-how in the early 1990s to carry out suicide bombings. And those suicide bombings, as you know, took place throughout the 1990s, and it destroyed the peace process. I would say that Hamas and Iran teamed up to destroy any prospect of peace. Yeah, sure, Arafat was terrible, but really it was Hamas that carried out most of those suicide attacks that really shook Israel to its core. And I remember actually studying in Israel in 1994, going back again to grad school in 1998 through 2000. And I can remember, being incredibly close to where suicide bombings were taking place in Jerusalem in particular. And it had Iran's fingerprints all over it. Now, after 2000, the Intifada began, And that suicide bombing campaign ticked up even further. And we saw hundreds of them. And Iran openly bragged about the assistance that it was giving. Now, Israel, as you may remember, built that security barrier around the West Bank and around the Gaza Strip. That stopped a lot of the suicide bombings because there were choke points that were suicide bombers, if they tried to get through, they were stopped. And so the suicide bombing almost entirely went away. But that's when we began to see the rockets flying out of the Gaza Strip. How did Hamas get the rockets? Surprise, they got it from Iran, right? Iran is continually the funder and supplier of these weapons. And so what we see, and even the tunnels that we see today, the drones, it all comes from Iran. And so the idea that somehow we can give Iran a lot of money and say that it's only to stop them from going nuclear, but don't worry about the terrorism. This is the approach that the Biden administration is taking. It's the same approach that the Obama administration took, and it is incredibly wrong. I have to say there were lots of things that you could say about Donald Trump, good or bad. His decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal was controversial, but I think he understood in his kishkas, as we would say, that the Iran deal was only going to help Iran get stronger over time because it allowed Iran to put more money in its coffers. And we know what Iran does when it has more money.
Someone did ask a question from the audience that I think pertains. Assume that the BCPOA was a mistake, or at least could have been much better. Was it a mistake for the US to leave the BCPOA? Wasn't it better than nothing we have now, and why?
So, I actually would say that it was a mistake on one level. At the time, the Trump administration was trying to push the Europeans to make changes to the JCPOA. They were saying, look, this is a totally flawed deal, which it was, and we need to fix this. So it was either fix it or nix it, right? That was kind of the term that was being thrown around. And there were people who were called fixers and there were people who were called nixers, and they were fighting about what the right approach would be. And I was a fixer. I actually, in my mind, I thought that if there were things that we could do to tighten up the way that we were giving Iran funding and to be able to block them from engaging in terrorism support, to block them from developing missiles and weapons, to make sure that weapons inspectors were coming in to really lock down that nuclear program, that these were the things that I thought were important at the end of the day. And Trump decided that he had had enough of it after a few months. He was actually close to coming to new terms with the Europeans in particular. The Brits, I understand, were making the most headway. And I think out of 4 issues or 5 issues, most of them were done. 4 out of 5, let's say, they had locked down. But then came the time where Trump had to give a waiver once again for the sanctions that had been repealed. And he said, you know what, guys, I've been patient enough. I'm not doing this anymore. And he pulled out. And I think it was a shock to everyone. I think that, there are those who would argue that had he waited another 2 or 3 weeks or a month, maybe they would have gotten the fix that they were all looking for. And I would have preferred it, because right now, what we see is an Iran that is racing to a nuclear weapon, and there are no restrictions on it whatsoever. So, look, is that Trump's fault that Iran is going nuclear? No, it's Iran's fault that Iran is going nuclear. Iran is a genocidal regime that seeks the destruction of the state of Israel, and they would like a nuke in order to be able to do it. So the only question is the way in which we pulled out. Was it the right thing? Was it the right timing? And I think people will be debating that for many years to come.
Do we know how close they are to building that nuclear weapon, and what Israel is doing and how they can protect themselves,
so
in spite of what the U.S. is doing or not doing to
Yeah, I mean, look, the Israelis are very nervous. I would say that the coming year is going to be likely a fateful one when it comes to Iran's nuclear program, because the administration is incredibly desperate to get a deal because they don't want a conflict with Iran over its nuclear program. The Israelis, I always like to say the Israelis are a really strong regional power, but they're not a superpower like the United States. And so they're going to have a harder time taking out that nuclear program. They've got a small Air Force. It's one of the best in the world, but it's, I think, a little bit more than 100 planes, give or take, maybe 120. And so it's going to be difficult for them to carry out an attack along the lines of, I think, what we envision. Also, don't forget, the Israelis have to travel a long distance to get to Iran. They would need to refuel multiple times. And then they have to hit targets, some of which are buried deep inside a mountain, with the expectation that there could be an attack against their nuclear facilities. So, if you're asking me whether it's an easy thing for Israel to attack Iran, the answer is no. But are there other tools that Israel has in its arsenal? Absolutely. And we've seen it. I mean, there is something that is going on right now. The Israelis call it the war between wars, where they're assassinating nuclear figures, where they are attacking military installations in Syria. They're destroying ships that belong to Iran on the high seas. They're interdicting smuggling of weapons that Iran is trying to move closer to Israel before they can be used in a future war. So the Israelis, I think, are going to continue to engage in that kind of asymmetric warfare. But the real question, and Karen, I don't know how to answer it in full, is, if they see Iran enter what is known as the zone of immunity, where, they're steps away from having that nuclear weapon and no one can stop them. Israel has made it clear that it will attack. What that attack looks like, I think probably only a handful of people know, but we're all holding our breath, because I think the Iranians have made it clear they don't want to negotiate with the Biden administration. They're done with talking, and they certainly seem to have very clear military aims, and those aims really are directed primarily at Israel.
Thank you. I'm going to take it back to the book and a question from the book. The bombing of the metro was a really dramatic moment in the war. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Sure. So, I don't know how many of you were watching during that time, but I remember the day. It was May 13th, and it had been already 4 days of war. And my wife said, "You know what? I'm getting you out of the house. I want you to come out to the backyard. You're gonna make a garden with me this afternoon." It was a beautiful spring day, and I said, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." But the whole time I'm kind of looking at my phone. Every few minutes, I put in the fence, and then I look at some tweets, and I couldn't quite let it go. Anyway, we were outside for maybe an hour or so, and then all of a sudden it was around evening time. I want to say it was around 5 or maybe 6 o'clock. And I see tweets in both English and in Hebrew from the IDF, from the Israel Defense Force. And it indicated that Israel had put troops on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And I said, okay, I told my wife, I said, I'm going in. I got to watch this. I said, I can't believe that Bibi is doing this, because for anybody who knows Benjamin Netanyahu, you'll know this is a guy that didn't like, he didn't want to have ground wars. He didn't want to have messy wars where he wouldn't be able to extricate quickly. He was a very deft politician, and he knew that this has often been the unraveling of other Israeli politicians in the past. You got a long lingering war. It doesn't look good to the Israeli public. So I said, okay, I don't believe this. I got to go in. And so I turn on Channel 11, Con News, and I'm looking at the correspondent. He's standing on the hill overlooking the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip's behind him, cameras on him, middle of the night. And he's looking at his phone like this, right? And he's scratching his head, and it's like, none of my sources inside the Kiryat, inside the Defense Department, nobody can confirm that we're on the ground. And by the way, I'm looking behind me over here, and I don't see any tanks going in. I don't see troops going in. I don't know what's going on. So I said, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to turn to Channel 13. Channel 13, same thing. Correspondent saying, I just talked to every one of my contacts inside the Kiryat. I can't confirm it. So here's what happened. The IDF tweeted this with one audience in mind, and it was Hamas. What the IDF had learned, what Israeli intelligence had learned over the previous 5 or more years, was that Hamas had prepared a very sophisticated network of tunnels underground under the Gaza Strip. And the goal was that when Israel would come in with ground troops, that they would flood the tunnels with Iranian trained commandos, and those commandos would pop up from the tunnels, and they would kill or kidnap as many Israeli soldiers as they possibly could. And so the IDF was ready for them. And the IDF, as soon as they started putting those commandos in the tunnel, the IDF started blowing up the tunnels. And it was a remarkable moment in the war. I think it really turned the tide of the war. And it was a huge victory for Israel, except there was one problem. And that was that the journalists who had believed the IDF and who had actually asked the Israeli government spokesman whether this was true or not, and he confirmed it, they were furious. They said, you used us as a tool in order to gain the upper hand over Hamas. And I'll just say this. First of all, the journalists that missed this, I have to say, they may have been misled. And I think it's quite possible that they were. But if I was able to turn on Israeli TV within 5 minutes to determine that there was nobody on the ground, why couldn't they? Why was it that they missed the story? Why was it that they weren't talking to Israeli journalists? And I should just say this here. Israeli journalists are some of the best in the world. They have no interest in spreading Zionist propaganda, okay? They are there because they are serious professionals, and they have no problem toppling an Israeli government, revealing corruption, bringing down the president of Israel and putting him in jail. These are the sorts of stories that Israeli journalists break all the time, and they're not playing games. And so the idea that somehow American journalists don't need to talk to the most professional people who have the best networks and the best understanding of these wars, it's a serious flaw in the coverage of American journalists of this conflict. This conflict is covered by thousands of journalists from all over the world. If they're ignoring the Israeli press, they're ignoring it at their peril. And so I would say that, look, Israel, maybe it deserved a slap on the wrist for this metro incident, but I would say that the journalists themselves also deserve a lot of blame. The last thing that I'll say on this is that, Israel has a very small margin of error. It cannot lose the war, as I think you all know, right? It is a tiny country, and if it loses one war, it's probably lost its last. And so if Israel does these things, I think you have to understand why they do them. They need to win. And so if their messaging helped lead to that victory, I think the Israelis are willing to take that and then to try to repair the relationships afterwards, which I think they're trying to do. I know journalists next time will probably be much more careful and maybe not so trusting of the IDF spokesperson, but you know what? They probably should have just turned on the TV.
That's true. Can you talk about the bombing of the Jalaa Tower? Because if I had seen one tower fall so many times on Instagram, as much as I did this tower, and heard so many different reports and actually on every news station, and seen it falling on Twitter so many times, and the same reporter standing outside talking about what happened and what didn't happen. Some people may not have seen it and may not know exactly what happened, but if you can cover that, I think it was fairly, I would say, consequential and dramatic because of the businesses that were inside of it.
Sure. So this is the tower that was destroyed. It was right around the middle of the war. I don't remember the exact date. I'm going to say it was probably May 14th or 15th. So about halfway through the war. The Israelis made a very significant decision. They were going to destroy a building, an entire building. The Israelis don't usually do that. There are a lot of high-rise towers in the Gaza Strip, and they leave them be. They usually go after the people who are launching rockets, which is usually, in between homes or next to schools and things like that. But never do you see kind of military activity in a large apartment building like that. The Israelis, what they did is they actually called the owner of the tower and told him to vacate the building. And then after that, they have this remarkable technology where they're able to identify all of the cell phones in a particular building, and they called each one of them, and an Arabic speaker warned the residents of the tower to get out. And they gave them, I don't know, whatever it was, a half hour to clear the building. And the owner went around door to door, floor to floor, getting everybody out of the building. Then when everybody was cleared out, the Israelis dropped what's known as a knock-knock bomb. This is a small explosive It does not do damage, but what it does is it shakes the building and alerts the residents that a larger explosion is about to happen. And then they waited again, and then they destroyed the building. Now, the reason why it got so much attention, I mean, it was a visual that I think people on Twitter and Instagram like to share when they're anti-Israel. They were saying, look at the destruction and the havoc that Israel's causing. But I would say that the debate in the United States here and maybe in other places around the world was actually more about the inhabitants of some of the office suites. The first inhabitant to mention is AP, and the other one is Al Jazeera. Let me talk about both of those for a minute. AP, the Associated Press, there was a really interesting story that came out. I want to say it was after the 2014 conflict. There's a journalist by the name of Mati Friedman. He's a Canadian who made Aliyah to Israel, I want to say probably 20 years ago. And he's a terrific journalist. He was actually working at AP. And he wrote a damning story in The Atlantic about how the AP was aware of the fact that Hamas was firing rockets right next to the AP building, and nobody said anything. There was no reporting about it, and that he was irate and he complained, and he was told that if he wanted to be able to continue to report from these places, that he couldn't complain because Hamas is, of course, the terrorist organization, and they make the rules in the Gaza Strip. And there was actually another reporter that corroborated Mati's account of what had happened, and the two of them were very frustrated. And of course, I don't think either one of them works for AP any longer. Now, the other inhabitant in this building, apart from AP, was Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, let's just say this: Al Jazeera is owned by the government of Qatar. Qatar is a funder of Hamas. They have pledged and provided tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas over the years. Qatar is one of the largest sponsors, if not the largest sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood in the world, and Hamas is a splinter faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, that was, I think, automatically something that I would say was suspicious. But then on top of that, you've got to remember this, that in the wars that America has fought in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the United States has actually targeted Al Jazeera, and they have had knockdown, drag out fights with the government of Qatar. The US government has really locked horns with the Qataris because somehow Al Jazeera knows exactly when terrorist attacks are going to take place. And they're there 3 minutes before a terrorist attack that kills Americans. They're right there with the camera on and ready. They were somehow the ones that always got Osama bin Laden's videos before anybody else. I don't think it's really any, this is not a surprise here. Al Jazeera we've got some real concerns, and nobody seemed to voice them. Now, the other thing that was amazing was that there was a woman by the name of Layla Al-Arian, the day after the Jala Tower was destroyed. Layla Al-Arian writes an article, and it appears in the New York Times, where she slams the Israelis for destroying this building because there's an apartment in there that's gone from generation to generation in her family. Well, here's the thing. She talks about her family, but she didn't actually mention who her father was. Her father was Sami Al-Arian, who was indicted for supporting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in a Florida court in the early 1990s. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, folks. There is just, one story after another that the media missed or decided not to report on properly. As a result of the story, the Israelis were, widely skewered and excoriated for being, the actor that was trying to kill journalism during the war. But nobody mentioned what had happened at AP the 7 years prior. Nobody mentioned the role of Al Jazeera and other terrorist attacks all around the world. And then here's the last part. The Israelis ultimately provided evidence to the United States, which the United States has apparently accepted as truth. And that is that inside the building, there was a Hamas office. And inside that Hamas office, they had technology that was jamming Iron Dome. Iron Dome, as you know, is the technology that has prevented thousands of rockets from hitting Israel. It has probably saved tens of thousands of lives over the years. Now, if in fact there was that technology jamming Iron Dome, Israel had no choice but to strike that building. And when they did, they were able to destroy the technology that was trying to harm Iron Dome and to harm the 9 million Israelis that relied on it. So the whole thing was poorly reported from start to finish. I think it's now justified, but you got to remember, Once the story breaks, once a narrative has been set, it's really hard to overturn it. And again, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get this book out sooner rather than later. It was just so sorely missing from the coverage at the time.
Listen, I'm going to put your book again in the chat. I want to ask you one last question before we go into the audience questions, into the chat questions, and please put your questions in the chat directly to me. What should we be watching for next? What can we expect? Do we expect something like this to happen again? Do we expect what are we looking at in terms of what's up next?
Sure. Look, I'll just say this, and I describe it in the book. There is a pattern to all these wars. I mentioned there was one in 2009, one in 2012, another was in 2014, and then this one. It starts with Hamas collecting weapons and preparing for the next round. Then Israel identifies where those weapons are, and they have what's known as a target bank, where lawyers go over these targets and they approve them in advance so that when war breaks out, Israel's prepared. And then during the time that Hamas is accruing all this weaponry, it's firing the occasional rocket at Israel because, that's what Hamas does. Israel will not respond to every one of them. That's not what Israel does. Israel doesn't actually want a war in Gaza. It's not worth it. They have nothing in there that they want. Gaza is kind of a lost district. It's a place for 2 million people that live there that, there are no resources. There's no business. There's nothing there that the Israelis want. There's no reason to go to war. But Hamas doesn't care. Hamas knows that they exist to fight Israel, and they look for excuses. They will land on an excuse like they did with this real estate controversy. And then they will begin to fire rockets. And they will fire them in larger numbers, or they will fire them at Tel Aviv, or they will fire them at Jerusalem. And that's when Israel says, okay, that's enough, guys. We've had enough of this, right? You can only poke us so many times. And then the war begins. The media will start to scream. They will talk about how terrible Israel is. But in fact, Israel is using that target bank, legally approved targets, where they're trying to take out terrorist targets only. And Israel does this for the course of the war. Hamas knows it's going to lose. But what they do is they brag about how the fact that they still are alive at the end of this. They talk about their resistance to Israel no matter what it takes. And this wins over the hearts and minds of the Palestinian people. And then at a certain point, Israel runs out of targets and Hamas runs out of rockets, and it starts to slow. And that's when Egypt and the United States or the Europeans come in and they try to broker a ceasefire. Usually it takes a day or two, and then it all stops. And then Hamas starts to build up that rocket store again, and we're on track again for round 5. And that is unfortunately what we're going to do unless we start cutting off the funds of Hamas. And to do that, we need to not give Iran billions of dollars in the Iran nuclear deal that America is trying to get back into right now. We need to stop the support that we provide to countries like Turkey and Qatar and Malaysia, which are actually, these are countries that actively support Hamas, and we have to stop that. So there's that. And I would just say that this is something that we all need to think about now. All 4 of the countries that I mentioned are huge problems, and they will continue to do this unless the United States turns the screws on them. And so there's a lot to learn here about how to prevent the supporters of Hamas from remaining strong, because as long as they're strong, Hamas remains strong. The last thing that I'll just say is we need to watch what happens in the north. During the north, and I talk about this in the book, there were 6 rockets that were fired out of Lebanon. Nobody knows exactly who fired them. My concern is that Hamas has built up some military infrastructure with the goal of drawing Israel into a 2-front war. So in other words, the next Gaza war that breaks out, maybe they end up having to fight in Lebanon and in Gaza. And as you all probably remember, the 1973 Yom Kippur War was really the last time that Israel fought a 2-front war. And that was not a very pretty war for Israel. They almost lost, and it was a very traumatic war because of the sheer number of casualties and the brutality of their enemies. But it would have been a lot easier had there been one front. And this is, I think, the real concern that I have, is that Hamas may be trying to exploit the chaos and to try to draw Israel into a fight in Lebanon as well.
Any comments on reports of Iran building a nuclear facility in Syria?
I have not seen anything specifically about a nuclear facility there. There was, of course, the one that Israel destroyed in 2009 during the Bush administration, where the Israelis carried out a daring raid, much like the one that they carried out in Iraq in 1981 to destroy Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor. The one that they destroyed in Syria actually looked remarkably similar to a North Korean nuclear facility. And so it's possible that the Assad regime did that. What I think the Israelis are more concerned about right now, and by the way, you see attacks happening day and night. I mean, the Israelis are bombing Syria constantly, but it's for not because of nuclear related issues. They're bombing Syria because Iran is trying to smuggle what is known as PGMs, precision guided munitions, into Lebanon so that Hezbollah will have an arsenal of rockets. Most of the stuff that Hezbollah fires into Israel, they're dumb rockets. They're unguided. So in other words, you kind of aim them into Israel and you hope that it hits something. That's the Hezbollah mentality. It's the Hamas mentality. Well, Iran realizes that this is probably the reason why Hezbollah and Hamas keep losing to Israel, is they don't have the same accuracy. So what they've done is they've started a project where they're smuggling in entire PGMs, precision guided munitions, so the entire rocket, or they put on fins. So they're smuggling in fins to stabilize the rocket so they can guide the rocket. The microchips that are needed, the GPS systems that are needed, the software that's needed in order to guide these rockets and to be much more accurate. And the fear that we hear in Israel right now is that if these rockets are successful, they could do two things. One is they could potentially evade Iron Dome, right? They have evasive maneuvers, so they can go up and down and sideways to get out of the way of Iron Dome. That's one. And then the other thing is, of course, when we talk about precision, they're able to target things within 5 yards, 10 yards of their intended mark. And what that means is that they could try to hit the Dimona reactor, the nuclear reactor in Israel. They could try to hit the chemical plant in Haifa. They could try to hit the Azrieli towers in Tel Aviv. These are the sorts of things that Hezbollah is trying to do, and Israel is trying to stop all of that by bombing. And so it is a cat and mouse game. It's been going on for many years now, really since I would say 2013, and the Israelis have a name for it. It's Hamilchama ben Hamilchamot, or the war between wars. They call it the Mabam. They like acronyms, just like we do for Milchama ben Hamilchamot. But they see this as an ongoing process. They can't stop. They can't sleep. Every day, every night, they're trying to stop these weapons. They have excellent intelligence. They're doing a great job. Are they getting all of them? I doubt it. And so we're concerned about what may happen next out of Syria or out of Lebanon as a result of these weapons.
So I think this next question is interesting, and it's curious to me too. How, talking about the American media, how do they not see or understand what's going on when we have Palestinian protesters yelling to bring the Intifada to streets of they bring it to streets to U.S. cities, and it means violent attacks, right? I mean, we see it in New York City, and we've seen it in LA, and I mean, I've seen it in a number of cities, and it's loud and it's big, and it's not like it's just 5 people. It's large, massive groups of Palestinians shouting with microphones on New York City, the Brooklyn Bridge, by the Empire State Building. And I'll take it even further to say that it's, I'm sure you know, all of our college campuses where it's just wide and it's spread. So how does, I'm assuming they just choose to ignore it is the answer, but how does media not see this and not understand how harsh the reality really is?
Oh, I think they understand the sort of genocidal nature of those calls. But I think, there is a slant. There are editorial choices that are being made in most of our mainstream media. And it's become entrenched at this point. And it's obviously highly problematic. I would say that I'm even less concerned about that, because I think it's a constant. And I think the Israelis are they just look at it like the sun rises and the sun sets. The media takes on this, this stance, and it's not likely to change. I'll tell you what I was more concerned about was that, these protests and this rhetoric, it didn't stop at rhetoric and it didn't stop at protests, right? We saw people go out into the streets and stab Jews and beat Jews as a result of the war. And, I think what we saw was that it was radicalizing people and actually normalizing violence. And I've never seen a conflict, to my recollection. I can't remember any other conflict. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, nobody was going around stabbing or beating up the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, right? Where you're blaming an entire cultural group or sect or religion for the actions, by the way, justifiable actions of a nation state. And so I saw that kind of stuff, and I began to realize that this was much bigger than just a political dispute. The politics that we have here in the United States have become radicalized. There's no question about it. It's a very polarized moment in American history, but we see those that take this rhetoric to another place. And it's for that reason that I actually think that, when the media ignores it, when the public ignores it, it's a much bigger problem than people realize, because it does have real world ramifications. There are life and death implications to some of this rhetoric.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to have one last question, and then I'm going to ask you what we can do as a whole, as a group, as an organization. But what is the relationship, if any, between Hezbollah and Hamas?
Great question. I mean, look, in the early 1990s, the Israelis got really worried about the rise of Hamas. And what they did is they actually expelled a number of them to Lebanon. And when these leaders went to Lebanon, they actually connected with Hezbollah. Hezbollah was actually the group that had invented the modern suicide bombing. And what Hezbollah did is they taught Hamas how to do it, and sort of the ideology behind it, this idea of martyrdom. And Hamas took it on board, and they began to perfect the suicide bombing. So in other words, Hezbollah invented it, Hamas perfected it. And so during the 1990s, you saw that, but also Hamas found itself training alongside Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the older brother, if you will, of these Iran-backed terrorist groups. Hezbollah is a little bit more professional. They've got a larger arsenal. They're just a bit more battle hardened. Hamas is a bit more ragtag. It's obviously, I think it's that case because, Israel is able to really halt a lot of the activity of Hamas. They, have controlled the Gaza Strip, and even when they don't control it, they have very good intelligence. In Lebanon, it's a sovereign state. It's a collapsing one right now, but it's still a sovereign state. And so Hezbollah has had a greater degree of independence. But over time, Hezbollah has worked with Iran and worked with Hamas. They call themselves the axis of resistance. They actually see themselves as part of a whole. They see themselves as part of a group that is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. And by the way, also the destruction of the United States. They talk about these sorts of things openly. Now, Hezbollah still, I would say, Hezbollah is a little bit more subservient to Iran than Hamas is. Hamas still maintains some independence in its command structure. There is a consensus that is built toward war or towards politics among internal and external leaders, and those that are based in Iran, and those that are engaged in military activity, those that are based in Turkey. And that's not the same as Hezbollah, but they share a lot of the same ideological components. They share the same patron in Iran. They share a lot of the same weaponry. They've been trained in much the same way. They've trained alongside each other in Syria and in Sudan and in other jurisdictions. So they are big and little brother together, and their father is the Iranians.
Incredible. So I want to say that education is power and key, and there's much more in Jonathan's book, which is, I'm going to remove my filter.
Here, I got it. I got you. Here you go.
Okay, thank you. I'm still going to remove my filter.
There you go.
There. Education and knowledge is key, especially in these types of situations where someone like Jonathan has so much education and so much knowledge. And I think it's so important for everyone. Honestly, I think it's important for people in my age group. I think it's important for people in the age group above me, and honestly, very important for the people in the age group below me. I will tell you that I am in my 40s. So people in the age group below me really need to be educated. I feel that I really try to do that on a daily basis because we are lacking a little bit there. I don't know what happened in that generation. So please, Jonathan's book is out. It's on Amazon. We did drop the link. Jonathan, thank you so much. I want to ask you, is there anything that we as an organization can do more? Is there anything that the people on the call can do more? The people that will inevitably watch this on YouTube can do more to speak more, to educate more, to talk more, to share more? What can we do as a people who want to help and to do more?
Look, I mean, first of all, thank you. And thank you for everything that you do. What I would say is, the Iran deal is a huge issue that I would suggest that everybody track and remain engaged on. Talk to
someone just said that.
Yeah, it's a vitally important issue. The other thing is to think about what happened. I mean, the Israelis, I mentioned, they fight the war between wars, right? They're constantly trying to weaken the enemy in between the wars. If you're concerned about what will happen during the next flare up, and you need to think about what happens in between them. And the idea here is learn, and don't just learn about Israel. Learn about Israel's neighbors. Learn about Israel's enemies. Learn about Israel's peace partners. In other words, don't just think about what's happening in this one country, important as it may be, and important to all of you as it may be. The issue here is that if you truly want to understand Israel's predicament, you want to understand America's predicament in the Middle East, you need to learn about all the surrounding countries. And that's what I've tried to do here. I tried to put a little bit of shape to all of that. And I hope I'm successful in doing it. And I thank you for having me.
You were very successful, and we thank you for your time. We thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here on a Thursday night at 7:30 p.m. rather than a Tuesday night, which we've been doing for over 2 years. We will see you again this Tuesday for a visit to Israel, to the Ayalon Center. So we hope to see you. Thank you again, Jonathan. We really appreciate it, and have a great night, everybody. If you missed part of this call, I just put the link. I saw some people just logged in just now, so perhaps it's a time difference situation. I just put the link. It is already on YouTube for you to go and watch at your convenience. Jonathan, people are saying thank you, wonderful talk, toda rabah, and excellent informative presentation. So yes, already. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Jonathan. Have a great night.